For gamers like myself, there's no better feeling than seeing a brand new trailer for a new horror game that appears to have a lot of promise. Rather, the new trailer reveals never before seen gameplay mechanics or terrifying footage that will probably keep us up at night. The announcements of new horror games always gets me extremely excited as someone who is obsessed with this genre. Unfortunately, despite the potential that these horror games may have, the fact is that these video games may never get released. It doesn't matter if these games are being developed with a AAA budget or even if they are part of an ongoing franchise, the risk is always there. So in this episode of Nerdspace Games, I'm taking a look at every single horror game that was announced and had a lot of potential but were unfortunately cancelled for one reason or another. Keep in mind that for this list, I'm only including games that were officially announced at some point, not rumored and not leaked. And this should be obvious, but I'm only including games that are in fact cancelled or at the very least have received radio silence for years, leading us to assume that they are completely dead. Oh, and I'm not going to be including different versions of a game that was never released, but we did get some kind of version of it, if that kind of makes sense. For example, don't expect Resident Evil 1.5 on this list or anything similar to that. The last thing I want to do before we get started is to give a quick shout out to a website that I use to get a lot of information regarding canceled games. So thank you to Unseen64. I'll link their website in the description down below. Anyway, with all of that out of the way, my name is Ruben with Nerdspace Games, and this is my top 10 best canceled horror games that had the most potential. Let's get it. Number 10, Agartha. Agartha was a horror game that started development back in 2000 with the game set to release on one of the most underrated consoles of all time, the Sega Dreamcast. Developed by No Cliche, this game would follow the main protagonist, Kirk, as he ventures to a Romanian village that is near the ancient city of Agartha. While in this town, Kirk would come across demons, angels, the undead, and many other prisoners of Agartha, where evil rests. The game would take a lot of inspiration from Alone in the Dark and Silent Hill, where the main character will need to defeat disturbing monsters, meet strange characters with mysterious backgrounds, and solve puzzles like you would expect in a classic survival horror game. The snowy mountain setting would feel unique and different from most survival horror games we've seen up until this point, in the time period of the 1920s would set the game apart with unique architecture throughout the entire village and the city. No Cliche looked to take advantage of the Dreamcast hardware, with visuals and the set designs looking really damn impressive in some of the concept art and game footage. Just like Silent Hill games, Agartha would explore multiple endings, but with its own morality system that would be based off of Kirk's decisions when dealing with the villagers. The player could choose to help them and seal off the evil city of Agartha, or work with the demons and let the entire village die. Agartha had a lot of potential, but unfortunately it was cancelled due to something that was completely out of the developer's control. Sadly, despite the impressive capabilities of the Sega Dreamcast, Sega would fail to support the console, and ultimately they would exit the console wars completely by 2001. Since Agartha was being developed exclusively on a Sega Dreamcast, it, like many other games that at the time were in development for this console, would be forced to cancel the game completely. Number 9, the Stranger Things, the TellTale game. Back in the day, TellTale games were at the top of the world. They were the king of taking popular TV properties and making some of the most narrative-focused stories in video games. To this day, I would argue that the Walking Dead series developed by TellTale Games is without a doubt one of the best horror games in terms of the story. So when TellTale announced that they were going to take on the Stranger Things, I was all in. Now there wasn't much announced about this project, and honestly we barely saw anything on it. Originally this game was announced back in 2018 but was unfortunately cancelled the following year by Netflix, who said that they were looking at a different direction for representation of Stranger Things in video games. Well, considering that all we've ever seen was shitty mobile games and an awesome cameo in Dead by Daylight that they also since removed from the game, yeah, fuck you Netflix. To be fair, it wasn't all on Netflix, as this was also around the time that TellTale was canceling a lot of projects and slowly moving towards the closure of their company as they were filing for bankruptcy. Going back to the game itself though, we can get an idea of what to expect from the canceled project by looking at TellTale's reputation with previous games. We could assume that the game would be a narrative-driven experience that would allow branching storylines based on decisions made throughout the main story. For those that never played a TellTale game, picture Until Dawn or one of the Dark Pictures games, but with a more comic book aesthetic. That's pretty much what the TellTale games are. Outside of that, the only noticeable feature in the small bit of gameplay that we saw was a sequence in which the player would be in first person while escaping a Demogorgon. Regardless, with the Stranger Things franchise dying down and TellTale Games officially being closed, with all of its assets under a new umbrella, chances are that this project will never see the light of day again. Number 8. Eternal Darkness 2. Out of all the entries on today's list, Eternal Darkness 2 had the least amount of information on it. Outside of a working title and an understanding of what made the first game so interesting, and a few words said by the developers at Silicon Knights, there really wasn't much to go on when analyzing the planned sequel to Eternal Darkness. So I'll do my best to go over what little details we do have and why I still think it's deserving of a spot on today's list. Let's first take a look at the first and only game of the franchise, Eternal Darkness: Sanity's Requiem. I don't want to sound like a broken record for any of you that's seen me cover this game before, as I do mention it a lot, so I'll get to the point. Eternal Darkness was a survival horror game that featured tank controls and a plot that would allow the player to travel to different time periods. However, the game defined a mechanic that was so iconic at the time and even now is regarded as one of the best mechanics seen in a horror game was the sanity meter. When filled, the game would begin playing tricks on the player, which included random jump scares, decapitation of the player's character, muting and turning off the TV, and much more. It was a groundbreaking mechanic that made Eternal Darkness a cult classic among survival horror fans. Unfortunately, the studio behind the game made mistake after mistake that led to the closure of the studio and the cancellation of the sequel to Eternal Darkness. The first issue came from the poor sales of Sanity's Requiem, with it releasing exclusively on Nintendo GameCube in the same year as 2 mainline Resident Evil games, plus the fact that it was on a console that wasn't really known for its horror games led to the game performing poorly in sales. Still, Silicon Knights had announced a sequel in which they would work to make a second game that was rumored to be on the Wii. However, Silicon Knights ended up in a lawsuit with Epic Games that would lead to them losing and having no choice but to close down the studio. Later, a new studio filled with Silicon Knights developers would start a Kickstarter for the sequel under the working title of Shadow of the Eternals, but due to the lack of support, this idea would fail and the project would once again be cancelled. This sequel to Eternal Darkness definitely had a lot of potential when analyzing the best parts of the first game, and to then imagine what this game could have accomplished with the use of motion controls on the Wii, damn, it really sucks that we never got to see it in action. Number 7. Redwood Falls. Announced back in 2006 for the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360, Redwood Falls was a lot of things combined into a single first-person shooter survival horror game. Set inside a small town in Alaska, players would control a police officer during the events of the game. At the start of the game, the player would see a bright light as something crashes into the nearby wilderness. Over time, animals and people will start to vanish until they once again turn up, but as something completely different. A lot of the inspiration for the monster designs came from John Carpenter's The Thing. On top of that, the development team behind Redwood Falls said that it would be an open world horror game that would focus on immersion and storytelling thanks to the different decisions that the player would make, complete with multiple endings. As a first-person shooter horror game, Kuju Entertainment said on multiple occasions that the game would feature a HUD-less perspective in order to make the gameplay more immersive. The most exciting feature, though, comes from the dynamic changes seen in both the environment and more specifically the enemies over time. As I said, the game took a lot of inspiration from The Thing. Basically, some unworldly creature would infect a population of Redwood, and these infected beings could at any time completely burst and change into a deformed creature. As for the environment, players would often find familiar areas changing in different ways during their time away from it. Unfortunately, Kuju Entertainment, the team behind Redwood Falls, would cancel this project in 2008 due to the lack of funding and would instead turn their focus to the rising market of mobile gaming. Great. Number 6. The Thing 2. It feels kind of funny following up Redwood Falls, a game that was inspired by The Thing, to then actually talking about a sequel to one of the best movie licensed video games out there. The Thing video game was a phenomenal survival horror game that played with mechanics in traditional survival horror games, but combined it with creature design straight out of the mind of John Carpenter, while also adding elements of a whodunit horror movie. Just like the movie, anybody in this game could actually be infected by this alien creature. Your job as the player is to identify these threats and take them out as soon as possible. Never knowing which character is going to betray you next added a unique level of fear to this already terrifying game. However, the sequel apparently planned to take this one step farther. Not only would the player still have to be cautious about who they can trust, but the creature transformations in this game was supposed to be even more terrifying. One example given by a developer on the team said that there was going to be a character whose upper body would rip off and then grab the pipes above him, swinging around like an orangutan with his intestines becoming tentacles of some sort that would attack the player. There were even some transformations and concept art revealed on all the different types of monsters that would be featured in the sequel. Sadly, The Thing 2 never completely crossed the finish line due to the closure of Computer Artworks in 2003, not long after announcing their sequel to The Thing earlier that same year. Number 5, Game of Death. Okay, this game definitely wouldn't have been for everybody. Game of Death was a project that was in development in 2001 by Burns Entertainment that was intended to be a unique take on psychological horror games. See, in this game, the main character would apparently end up in a fatal car crash that would put him in the hospital. Instead of straight up dying, the playable character would instead enter a dreamlike state where he'll be confronted by some of the deadliest serial killers of all time. In order for him to survive his injuries and wake up in the hospital bed alive and well, he'll need to kill these killers in the same way that these killers would normally kill their victims. It's actually kind of fucked up, but interesting in a kind of fucked up way. But it gets much worse, as apparently this game would feature real life killers such as Jeffrey Dahmer and Charles Manson. Then the game would challenge the player to investigate each maniac before they could officially kill them. See, as I said earlier, the only way a killer can be killed in this nightmare-like world is by using a similar method to the killer's MO. So the player would be forced to review old case files and crime scenes in order to identify the weaknesses of each killer. On top of that, the game would feature a morality system. Obviously, becoming a killer outright just to survive could have some extreme consequences for your character when he wakes back up in the hospital. So depending on the circumstances around each murder you commit in this nightmare world, your character could wake up and become the next Jack the Ripper himself. Apparently, to avoid this fate, the player would need to find unique ways of killing the killers, but in a way that won't turn him into a killer himself. For example, killing a killer in self-defense, or even doing it in order to protect one of their victims. Doing so will allow the morality compass to sway towards you being a good person. Because obviously if you're going to kill 40-something murderers, you should do it in a nice and understandable way. That's basically the message here, right? In all seriousness, the game was supposed to feature over 40 maniacs, both real and fictional serial killers, in which you could journey to each of their realities from a skeleton-like hub area. The game sounded completely insane, and it's a tragedy that we will never get to see it. As for why it was cancelled, well, you could probably guess based off of everything I just said. Burns Entertainment ran into a lot of problems trying to find a publisher for the game due to its very dark premise, and unfortunately they were forced to cancel the project altogether. Number 4, Death of Rose. Death of Rose was a game being developed by an indie developer by the name of Arthur Lakowski, who also worked on some of Bloober Team's biggest projects, including the Blair Witch Project and Layers of Fear. Before I go any farther, no, this game has nothing to do with The Royal Rose, which, by the way, is a hidden gem that you should definitely play if you get your hands on it somehow. Anyway, back to this game. Death of Rose was announced back at the start of 2020, as it was supposed to be a game inspired by Silent Hill and supermassive games like Until Dawn. I mean, from that premise alone, Death of Rose immediately had me hooked. The game would follow Scott, a radio host that finds himself exploring an abandoned haunted school in search of content for his show. Well, Scott gets exactly what he's looking for when he comes across some terrifying ghosts and what reminds us of Lisa and PT. As you would expect from someone that has worked with Bloober Team for years, the atmospheric setting of this abandoned school is spot on for a horror game. In the gameplay trailer, we get to see different environments, and at one point, we get to see the school transitioning into a different reality of some sort that kind of reminds me of the nightmare reality seen in Silent Hill. Bloober Team has always focused on characters first and foremost, and it appears that Death of Rose was going to take that approach as well, with Scott and Beth consistently talking and interacting with each other over the radio throughout most of the game. Unfortunately, beyond what we were told and what inspiration this game took, there wasn't much said. While the game was announced to release on February 20th, 2020, on that very same day, Lakowski said that the game would be delayed until March while a kind of big situation gets resolved. Not long after that, he hit up Twitter where he officially announced that Death of Rose was cancelled. He never did respond to any comments about why it was cancelled, but considering that he mentioned a pretty big situation, rumors speculated that it may have had to do with some sort of non-compete that he had with Bloober Team at the time. Regardless, Death of Rose had a lot of potential with the inspiration that it took from games like Silent Hill, PT, Until Dawn, and of course the catalog of Bloober Team games. Number 3, Black Death. Black Death was a first-person survival horror game that would take a lot of inspiration from games like Condemned Criminal Origins, but also infuse it with elements of an open-world zombie game. Instead of being in a city full of criminals, you are instead inside of a city full of infected people caused by some sort of black fog. Surprisingly, there are a lot of other unique elements that were featured in this game that kind of remind me of other horror games out there. This thick black fog somewhat reminded me of Silent Hill, and the fact that it would create a sense of uneasiness as you never knew what to expect as you ran down the streets of this town. The player apparently would have full customization to take down the infected in any way they saw fit, which reminded me of games like Dead Island and Dying Light. Then there was the idea that each infected person that you came across could be cured or killed, which then would result in multiple endings. This kind of reminded me of the Little Sisters in BioShock. The biggest feature that really had me intrigued though was the creation of this black fog that would sort of serve as the main antagonist. Think of the black fog in Resident Evil 3.5, but instead of supernatural threats, we get biological creatures. This fog would play tricks on you throughout the game, create terrifying and dangerous monsters with glowing eyes, and even force you to wear a gas mask that'll limit your visibility while also creating a thick fog that makes it more difficult to see where you are going. Oh, and side note, this game was being developed by Darkworks, which had delivered some of my favorite survival horror hidden gems like Cold Fear and Alone in the Dark: A New Nightmare. So personally, I had a lot of faith in these guys going into its release. Sadly, everybody else didn't. Darkworks would have trouble finding a publisher for Black Death due to both the lack of faith in the studio and the content relating to viruses in a time where swine flu was all over the media. And since they were unable to find any publishers, the studio ultimately closed down. Number 2, Allison Road. After the popularity that PT got before Silent Hills was officially cancelled, we began to see other developers take their shot at immersive storytelling with photorealistic first-person horror games. In the wake of that, we got great games like Visage and Layers of Fear. Yet there was one game that definitely stood out as being one of the first spiritual successors to PT. Enter Allison Road, a game that was announced back in 2015 just after Silent Hills was cancelled and before all of the carbon copies of PT started to pop out. Allison Road appeared like it would have a full release, unlike the game that it was inspired by. In Allison Road, you would play as an unnamed protagonist who is suffering from amnesia and is unable to remember the events prior to the start of the game. After waking up in what seems to be a townhouse, the protagonist begins searching the house for his missing family. The only footage that we currently have of the game illustrates the realistic visuals of the game as the protagonist searches the house and examines different objects. At one point, it looked like the player could equip a knife, which may have hinted to the fact that the game would feature limited combat at the very least. Also in the footage, we see a disturbing girl chasing down the protagonist and other disturbing moments created by the sound design of the game. Unfortunately, despite all of the promise that we saw in the 13 minutes of gameplay footage, Allison Road was officially cancelled. Well, sort of. Not long after this game was announced, Lilith Ltd would split with publishers Team 17 and cancel Allison Road due to the lack of funding. Then, in 2016, the head of Lilith Ltd and his new studio, Far From Home, announced that he would once again be picking up Allison Road and he would begin working on finishing the game. This is where things get weird though. Despite being an extremely recognizable name for his work as a visual arts director for big blockbuster movies, the guy kind of went silent. Since 2016, nobody's really heard from him in regards to his work on Allison Road. So unfortunately, there's been no updates, and considering that the game has been quiet for 8 years now, I think it's fair to say that this game is as good as dead. Number 1, Silent Hills. Did you really expect anything else at the number 1 spot outside of Silent Hills? Yeah, this game really looked like it was going to put the Silent Hill franchise on top and become a strong competitor to Capcom's Resident Evil. Especially since this would come after Capcom had led the RE franchise down a more action-focused route with its latest release of Resident Evil 6. The marketing and production behind Silent Hills was spot on. As I'm sure you already know by now, back in 2014, Sony released a playable demo of a new game from a fake studio called PT. Throughout the entire playable teaser, nothing in this game revealed the fact that this was actually a teaser for Silent Hills. That is, until the very end of the game. After playing through the entire demo, players would learn that PT was actually a playable teaser that announced Silent Hills, a brand new Silent Hill game. To make things better, we also learned that Kojima would be taking on this project and it would star Walking Dead's very own Norman Reedus. After being extremely happy and satisfied with the direction that PT took the series, Silent Hill fans were finally able to rejoice and celebrate the revival of the franchise after so many bad Silent Hill games since Team Silent was shut down after the 4th game. Sadly, this was short-lived. A falling out occurred between Kojima and Konami, which ultimately led to the cancellation of Silent Hills and Kojima getting fired by Konami. Of course, we would see Reedus and Kojima team up once again for Death Stranding, but let's face it, we all can't help but think, what if we actually got that Silent Hill game? But that does it for this episode of Nerd Space Games. Hit up the comments and let me know what you think of my list. Is Silent Hills the best horror game that we never got, or is there another one that's deserving of that title? Let me know down below. Also, I know there's plenty of other horror games out there that were canceled but unfortunately didn't make my list. Stuff like Cleric and Sadness, which are both great but sadly didn't make my top 10. So be sure to name any canceled horror games that you think deserves a special shout out in the comments below. Anyway, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to my channel for more survival horror content. Also, leave a like on today's video if you enjoyed today's topic. But thanks for watching, and as always, I'll catch you guys on the next episode of Nerd Space Games. Take care.